Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today on the topic of cybersecurity and ransomware. I'm sure you've all heard, it doesn't go too many days in a row before we hear about another cyber ransom attack or another organization whose data was exposed. And more importantly, now some of the attacks that are taking place on the infrastructure that we rely on, the Colonial Pipeline attack, or some of the utility commissions and wastewater authorities. But as businesses, we may not have the same threat landscape that a wastewater treatment facility or a Colonial Pipeline attack would have, but our business data, our information, our operations are still precious to us. I'm sure many organizations have walked in on a Monday morning with a coffee cup in hand, ready to start the day with purpose. They turn on their computer and oops, your files are encrypted. What do? Since 2016, we've seen on average about 4,000 ransomware attacks a day. Since the COVID-19 pandemic began, malicious email attacks are up 600%. And on average, about 11 seconds go by, another company is hit with ransomware. Cybersecurity is no longer just an IT or technology issue. This affects our operations, our personnel, and the sustainability of our organizations. We simply can't stick our head in the sand and think that I bought good IT hardware or my IT service vendor told me I'm okay. We have to go beyond that. We have to focus on how these attacks are happening. And I'm pleased to introduce Eric Cron from KnowBe4. KnowBe4 is a partner of Seubert Associates. They focus on the people side of cybersecurity, focusing on building resilience, empowering your employees, and educating them on why, what, and how they need to respond to this ever-growing wave of cyber attacks. Eric, thank you for joining us.
Hey, Joe, it's always a pleasure to be here where I can kind of share some of this information with folks. And you're right, this is such a significant time. And I love your analogy coming in on Monday morning with a coffee cup. And it's, oh man, what a bad way to start the week. It happens far too often, though, and it's unfortunate. But hopefully we can learn some things here today to help us understand where this sort of threats are coming from and what we can do to kind of protect ourselves from it a little bit better.
Absolutely. We're open ears, Eric. Take it away.
All right. Let me share my screen here while we're doing that. All right. Hopefully you see my screen here. This is the obligatory. Can you see everything? Can you see everything? Anyways, so yeah, what we're going to talk about today is what makes people tick and click. And the reason I like to do this one is, far too often, the way that this stuff gets spread these days, unfortunately, is through social engineering. So it's through phishing, it's through smishing or vishing, which is the SMS version, the text message phishing that you get, or vishing, which is the voice version where people call you, right? And we think that they're no big deal, right? We think about these things like the voice one, especially where we're kind of like, oh, you know what? They called and they said my social security number is expired. That's vishing, right? That's not as good as it gets. Believe me, they use that. But all of these have a common thing with them, and that is social engineering. And there's psychology behind this that makes it incredibly powerful. And I think a lot of organizations, unfortunately, downplay the level of sophistication that happens here. So that's what I want to do here is I want to share with you some of the psychology behind this, because I find that if we understand how these attacks work, we not only respect them a little bit more and understand what we're faced against, but we also have a much better time prepared to defend ourselves against them, quite frankly. So this is KnowBe4. We do security awareness training in a simulated phishing platform. That's our key thing. We also deal a lot in regulatory compliance type things, helping people be more compliant. We have some software for that, or a platform for that. But for the most part, we tackle the human element of cybersecurity. And, in my career, that's one of the things that I've noticed has been kind of lacking a little bit. And it's why I do what I do today. So my background, I am an IT and security guy. I am a techno geek. I'm surrounded by servers and Raspberry Pis and stuff like that in here. It's just who I am. But as much as I love technology, and I've been fascinated by technology for, eons, ultimately, what it boils down to is I've realized that the humans have been targeted so often. And so many of my problems, so many of my cleanup efforts have been because a human is targeted. Now, I want to be clear about this. It's not their fault. I don't place blame on the individuals that are getting targeted. That's not their fault. It's just that their job is to do marketing, not cybersecurity. So when they're faced with some of these threats, they may not be as prepared as hopefully they would otherwise be. But again, what I started doing is I started taking a focus on this. Now, I've worked in a lot of the hot industries for ransomware. Unfortunately, I've worked in healthcare. I've worked in a large manufacturing place where I was the IT manager. I did work for the DoD for about 10 years as a contractor for the U.S. Army, where I ended up being the security manager at the 2nd Regional Cyber Center, Western Hemisphere. Big words, fun to say until you have to answer the phone like that every day. But ultimately, like I said, I've seen it at a lot of different areas, but so many of them come back to targeting people. So that's what we're going to talk about here, is just kind of some of the stuff that I've learned throughout the years and some of the things that I see in what's going on out there. So this is very much going to be about emotions. Again, it's psychology. And the key psychology piece behind this is an emotional attack. So let's get started on this. This is what we're going to talk about: what the threat landscape looks like now, the emotional triggers, and defending ourselves. Those are the key things. So current threat landscape, let's get into this. You may have seen this meme before. I added the COVID-ism to it, but this is kind of the situation report for this year and even last year. Basically, there's fires going on all around us, and that's just part of our normal day, right? This is fine. This is normal. This is kind of what's to be expected. And, as cyber attacks continue to happen, we're honestly becoming a little bit desensitized to them. And I hate to say that, but it's a fact. If you remember way back when like the Target breach happened, that was a big deal. Everyone went, oh my gosh, but now it's like a daily occurrence that, oh, look, another 1 million or 2 million records got pulled by someone. And it's become one of those things where we just kind of go, it's another day. That doesn't mean that we're backing off the fight, but it means that it's become very much normalized for us. And unfortunately, that's going to continue to be the case. Now, we have to get past the point where we do become so normalized to this that we accept it as being something that's just a fact of life. We can say that, yes, this happens all the time, but we don't have to accept it, and we need to fight against it. So having said that, COVID-19, ransomware not taking a break. Ransomware has been brutal during this time. We got the pipeline. We got defense contractors hit, hospitals hit, pharmaceutical folks hit. In the beginning, there was actually a group of ransomware gangs that came out and said, we are not going to attack hospitals or medical places because of COVID. If we do accidentally get them, we'll give them free decryption keys. And that was all wonderful and grand and great, but there were all kinds of other groups that came in and said, yeah, no, we don't care. There's even groups that have been out there that said we target medical. Why? Because with ransomware, the key thing about ransomware is they take your information that you need to do your work and they hold it hostage. That means your data doesn't have to be valuable to anyone else but you. And that's what makes it so powerful in all of these different industries. Now, when you get into things like manufacturing, where timing is critical, you have to have all that stuff out there to create your widgets, or healthcare, where you need medical records before you can go in and do surgery on people. You need to know what their allergies are. You need to know pre-existing conditions. All of that stuff, when you take that away and you lock down those medical records, it becomes a big deal and it becomes very critical. Therefore, those people tend to be more willing or they have to pay to get the data back quicker. This is why it's so powerful. We need to understand that about ransomware. Now, the other one that's been going on a lot is called business email compromise. Now, BEC, or business email compromise, this is very simple stuff. This is the stuff we do hear about all the time. A lot of times we don't understand the umbrella it's over, but basically what it boils down to is this is a lot of the scams that we see, the wire transfer fraud, right? That's a really popular one. The attackers will spoof an email and send it out, and they'll say something like, this is CEO, I need you to transfer some funds, right? And if they just do it that way, if they just say, hey, this is the CEO, I need you to send $50,000 to this account, thanks, people are going to push back. Even against the CEO, they're going to say, hey, what's this for? I need to. So what they do is they wrap it in some very interesting emotional type stuff, okay? And so the first emotion is definitely that it's the CEO to begin with. Okay, so nobody wants to push back. against an executive and say, no, sir, ma'am. So they do some little things. And I'm going to go through one of these a little bit later with an example. But basically, they apply emotional pressure on the person by thinking that they missed an earlier email, or that the person has messed up somehow. And because they haven't transferred money, it's this whole thing's going to unravel. And they play this game with people to get them in this thought process where they don't understand and they're afraid they're going to lose their job. So what do? They panic and they wire the money. It's brilliant. It's incredibly effective. We're seeing, billions of dollars are lost every year due to business email compromise. Sometimes they're after not just the money, but W-2 fraud is an example of them going after sensitive information. So we see that pretty much every year. Beginning of the year, they come in and you see the messages saying, hey, this is executive so-and-so. I need you to send me all of the W-2s for the organization. I need to take care of them real quick. And then we'll send them to the tax guy. There's always something around it that makes it make sense that they need to see these things. But then the other person, again, doesn't want to push back, and they turn around and they say, hey, sir, ma'am, here you go. And lo and behold, the attackers then turn around and file taxes on behalf of all of the employees of that company, which happen to all get a refund that year. Go imagine that. So this is another very powerful one, but they're after information. It's not always money. And then last but not least, in the fun days here, I'm sure there are several people on this webinar right now that have seen the gift card fraud scams. And if you are, feel free to pop into the chat there that you've seen this. It's happened so often. And it's the same thing. It's basically an executive a lot of times saying, I need you to buy a bunch of gift cards. And the person goes, okay, well, why is it effective? Because of the games they play around it. We'll talk about that a little bit more. So the emotional triggers behind this stuff, this is where the rubber meets the road when it comes to social engineering or the practice of using humanity against ourselves. That's really what social engineering is. Now, it's important to understand that social engineering isn't always malicious. Okay, so before we get into that real quick, I love this. This is from a show called Mr. Robot. It was a show basically like a hacker show, and it was very embraced by the hacker community because it used real techniques and real tools. It wasn't like the CSI Cyber, where the person sits down at a keyboard, flips their hoodie up, and just bangs away randomly at the keys for a little while and comes back and says, I'm through the firewall. Okay, that doesn't happen that way. But this was using real techniques. And one of the key techniques they used was social engineering. They went after the people to get physical access to the building and other stuff like that. And I love this quote from that. It said, I have never found it hard to hack most people. If you listen to them and watch them, their vulnerabilities are like a neon sign screwed into their heads. This is so true. And it's not like busting on us as humans. It's just a fact. Humans tend to have a set of vulnerabilities. In other words, some of us react certain ways to aggression. Somebody gets aggressive with us. Some people back away. The other reaction is to push back at it hard. Okay. Those are, equal reactions going opposite directions. But that's basically the two things that are going to happen if somebody gets aggressive with you. That's the general gist of what's going to happen most of the time. And so we know that we can exploit either of those, the person pushing back or the person backing off. That's an example of that. Here's another interesting example. In a lot of places, there's buildings that have an outer and an inner door. So this is especially prevalent in places where there's, snow or inclement weather quite a bit. And so the outer doors are generally open. They're not secured with a badge or anything like that, but the inner doors are. So as a person, as a human, as a social engineer, if I time it so that I can meet somebody at that first door and hold the door open for them, they're going to go in and we're going to both go into that little antechamber there, if you will. And they are much more likely, because they feel like they need to reciprocate for the favor you just did for them. You open the door for them. Common custom says that they should hold the door open for you if they have the opportunity. They are more likely to hit the badge reader, which is going to be on the second door, and hold the door open for you and let you in. All you need is a badge that may even look good. It's printed, but it may not even be registered in the system. But you show them the badge, they go, okay, and they're going to open the door for you because it's reciprocation. That is one of the things that humans tend to do. So it's very interesting. It's a lot of psychology behind it, but this is what we mean when we have vulnerabilities. Just like computer systems have vulnerabilities in software, humans do too. Now let's talk about where this kind of comes into play. Well, we have this pandemic. 2021 or 2020 was one of the more interesting years in modern time, right? I think of the Chinese curse, may you live in interesting times. That's what we've had here, folks. But it's the first true global pandemic to rock our world. Organizations, we had to adapt quickly. So people were sent home. It was all just mayhem and madness when it all went down. Now, we were told at the time, we want to flatten the curve, give it a couple of, a couple of weeks, couple months, and we'll all take care of that. As we now move into nearly August of the following year, we realize that that's not going to happen over a couple of months. So it's been more persistent. So not only did we have all of this stress in the beginning, but we also now have it continuing. Okay. And so the initial shock was tough, but we tend to do well as humans in situations like that where we need to adapt quickly. Where it becomes tricky is when this drags on forever. And now the light at the end of the tunnel is no longer visible, and all this stuff is still going on. So continued economic struggles. We had the election in the middle of all this. It's been crazy for people professionally and personally. Now, stress has been a huge issue. Finances were a mess when people lost their jobs or had to step away. Here in Florida, we had a nightmare of a time with the unemployment insurance portal. People couldn't get registered. They couldn't get in. The portal was crashing all the time. They had no income. Huge stressors there, right? Information from all the areas really was sparse and contradictory. The government was issuing things. Basically, everybody has to go home, but there wasn't really a how to do that sort of thing. Or when the information came out, a lot of times it wasn't complete. And I'm not, giving them a hard time. They did what they could with the information they had at the time. But this was a problem because attackers sometimes took advantage of that. We had to shift to the work from home, and people had to have their kids all of a sudden working at home with them, right? Because daycares were no longer a thing. How many times have we seen people struggle with their kids running around while doing meetings, right? It's almost become normalized to us these days, but that was a huge stressor for a lot of people. And we couldn't even get toilet paper, right? And webcams, if you remember webcams, that was a nightmare too. We're still seeing issues with that though. We're seeing issues with, microchips and things like this being hard to do. You can't even buy cars these days. Stuff like that is happening. Now, the scammers just love this kind of pressure. Why do they love it? Because they use emotions and intense pressure in a sense of urgency to make people miss the signs that something's wrong. In other words, they get us so stressed out we can't think straight. If you've ever bought a home or done a major purchase like that, right? It's a very, very stressful thing. Would you want to be doing that though, when you were super upset about something or really mad about something? Is that the time to decide I'm going to buy a home? The answer is no. Why? Because when our emotions are in an uproar, we don't think very straight and we tend to make a lot of mistakes. This is just kind of how these things work. And I think we're all used to that. We understand that, but the attackers love this. So what they do is they like to go after people while they're in a state of high emotions. So, phishing and social engineering is nothing new. The key is people are at levels of stress now without even realizing it, that they had never thought of previous to this. What that means is it's easier for the attackers to push us into that state of emotional stress where we don't think straight, much easier. And what we have to understand is users and people are the pivot point within organizations where a lot of things go wrong. And what I mean by this is you basically have your couple of stages here. You have the proactive stuff you're trying to do to keep stuff from happening. You've got the reactive stuff, which is when something starts happening, you hope you can stop it from going any further or getting worse, right? And the user is kind of the pivot point between when these things happen. All right. So essentially, we try to block these like phishing emails and attacks from coming in. And we do a lot of that through technology, and it's fantastic. It's great. It really helps because there are literally like a billion emails a day that go out that are phishing and spam emails. So we need to reduce that to a usable level. Well, what happens then is the user gets these things and they have a choice to make. So the user is either going to interact with this, they're going to click the link, they're going to open the document, they're going to follow something that makes them put in password, username and password without realizing it. From that point, we're now reactive. We're hoping that our antivirus stops the virus from running. We're hoping that maybe DLP or data loss prevention controls keep data from being exfiltrated. That's the kind of stuff that we're really going for here. And we're hoping that these things don't happen. Okay. But you see where the user is the difference right there. And that's why it's so critical to understand this. And I'm not saying this because I work for a company that does this. I work for a company that does focusing on the human because I've seen this happen. I want to be very clear on that. As technical people, we tend to be drawn to technical solutions. It's what we're comfortable with. It's it's a great place for us. We know how to deal with that. Dealing with people is not something that we often like to do. As a technical person, I've never seen a situation where somebody is offered a job in, say, IT or security, and they said, I don't want to take the job. And the company came back and said, but if we let you train the humans, will you do it? And they say, oh yeah, absolutely. That's the deal for me. I get to train people. Now I get to come, work on the job. No, we're technical people. We're happiest in a server room with lots of noise and isolation, right? Unfortunately, we have to embrace the fact that this is going on, and we have to look at ways to do that because technology doesn't solve it all. Now, the reason that so much of this stuff is effective, and the reason all this stuff I've been talking about with stress and all that is important to understand, all kind of boils down to this little slide right here. And I love this because more than just in this context of scams and things like this, understanding this principle has helped me look back and understand why I've done some of the things in my life that I've done. Some of the mistakes, good things, bad things, whatever. And you look back at something and you go, what was I thinking? Right? We've all done that. We've looked back and we've said, what was I thinking? There were clearly signs here that something was going on. Why did I miss that? Well, it comes back to this. And I love this from Daniel Kahneman. This is the two systems of thinking, fast and slow. So system one thinking is our fast thinking. This is the stuff where, we live our lives in this. Probably 95% of our lives is spent in system one thinking. If you've ever driven your car on a long road trip or I don't know, even commuting to work sometimes, and you don't remember the last couple miles, like you were using your turn signal, you were braking, you were doing all that, but you really don't remember how you got from 5 minutes ago to now. That's system one thinking. It's automatic. It's habitual type stuff. It's muscle memory stuff that we do. Now, system one thinking is also, it's kind of the lizard brain thing, right? It's our things that we use to save ourselves, our instinctual thinking. So, for example, I'm at a soccer game with my kids. I'm sitting there, someone kicks the ball and it's coming at my head. Well, I don't stop and pull out a notepad and do calculus to figure out if I'm going to get hit with this ball, right? I automatically duck because there's no time to think about it. I automatically duck. Now, here's where it gets interesting. System one thinking, fast thinking, is very quick. It's instinctual, but it's also very prone to errors. So I'm not, the I guess most athletic person in the world or most coordinated. So I'm probably going to still get hit with the ball, even though I moved quickly, right? It doesn't really matter because things get miscalculated. That's system one thinking, though, when we're in that state where we're just kind of being reactive without critical thinking. And that's the important part. So again, we spend a lot of time in this state. What it means is to get to the next state, which is system two thinking, it actually takes an effort to move from cruise control to the system two thinking. So system two thinking is things where we're dealing with problem solving, very much so in critical thinking things or problem solving sorts of deals. But it takes a lot of effort. It's not very fast, but it's much, much more reliable. Okay. So if we're given a problem to solve, we are going to have to stop or we're going to have to step out of system one thinking, not stop it, but step out of it. And we're going to have to move into problem solving mode. It does take a lot more effort. And that's where it gets a little bit tricky. Okay. It's something we only do if it's necessary. And I'll give you an example of a math problem and how system one and system two works. If I say, what is 2 plus 2? You're immediately going to know it's 4. Or 5 plus 5 is 10, right? You're not going to have to whip out a calculator. You're not going to give any thoughts. It's reactive. It's mental. It's right there. It's muscle memory. But if I ask you what's the square root of 354, you're going to have to stop and do it, right? That's the difference between what happens here, all right? But the problem is this is where we do our critical thinking. What happens is with highly emotional states, it makes us much more prone to sticking to our instinctual stuff, i.e. system one thinking. So the more emotional we are, the more worked up we are, the harder it is for us to step away from something and apply that critical thinking step. That's a key thing. That's a really important thing to understand with this. Again, you don't buy a house when you're in a panic state. You don't make decisions to go buy a new car when you're all freaked out about other stuff. No, the way you do this is we may be nervous or something like that when we do this, but we don't do it during these other times where we're highly stressed. Now, keep in mind that all of the stuff we've been dealing with the pandemic has been driving us right into system one thinking. We're always stressed. And whether we realize it or not, the level of stress is much higher, meaning we're relying more on our day-to-day cruise control, not thinking about stuff, just trying to get it done, thinking, which is system one, far more than we are system two, if we think about it. So again, what they want to do, this is where the attackers want to get you. System one, where we're not doing critical thinking. That way, the things that we should have spotted shoot right past us. Now, if you think I'm crazy with some of this stuff with respect to psychology and stuff and how the human mind works, I got to tell you, I love this part of security, understanding the people. And there's some fun things I've learned while doing this. And one of those is we're gonna have a little fun now, because this has been kind of deep for a little while. So we're gonna have a little fun right now. And this is one of the things I love to do. I wish I could do this in person because I love seeing the reactions on people's faces when we do this. But we're gonna do a card trick. I don't know how many of you have done a card trick via PowerPoint before, but like I said, I absolutely love this. It makes us think about how vulnerable we are to some of this stuff. So if you haven't seen this before, awesome. You're going to learn something. I almost guarantee it. So first of all, I want you to pick a card. Pick any card. I don't care which card it is. I'm going to make your card disappear. So make sure you know which card is your card. And now here we go. Through the magic of a PowerPoint transformation or presentation here, is your card gone? And so this is the part where I see people look at each other and they're like, whoa, whoa. Okay. So if you're not doing that right now, just at least pretend for me so that I get that. But your card is gone. I guarantee your card is gone. So how did we do that in a PowerPoint? How did I identify and remove your card? Well, first of all, we started with this grouping of cards and we ended with that grouping of cards. So now that you can look at this, what do you notice is different? They're two completely different sets of cards. That's right. Rushing you through the process, getting you to focus on one card. This is a focus redirection tip. I'm getting you to focus on your card that's going to go away, not the cards around it. Now, by replacing the second group with a similar pattern, a color pattern here, you don't even notice that that happened. Now, if the second group of cards would have been 2 through 10, it would have been instantly apparent to you what's happened with this. So by doing this, like I said, rushing you through the process, making you into that system one thinking, you're not critically looking at all of the things around it. You're focused on the one thing, and then it makes it easy to trick you, right? So pretty amazing. Now, here's another part of this that I love about this example. If you see this card trick again, you know how it's done. Or at the very least, if you don't remember the specifics, you realize that, hey, there was a trick to this. And, they're going to do this. And it wouldn't matter which cards I used and put up there first. It really wouldn't matter. The fact is, you're going to see this and you're going to go, oh, that's a trick. I understand. I've seen it. I know that it's pretty simple. I don't remember exactly what it is, but it's something. This is important because what we're trying to do with people is get them to recognize scams the same way. It doesn't matter whether they're after gift cards. It doesn't matter whether they're after cash. It doesn't matter whether they're after whatever. When we recognize the tools that are in place or how this thing works, we don't even have to remember the details. We have to go, wait a minute, this reminds me of a scam that I've seen in the past. And this is a mindset that we have to have when it takes to teaching people how to prepare themselves for this. So far too often, what I see happen is people will put out, an email to folks that says, hey, everyone, there's an attack for Amazon gift cards going around. Be careful with Amazon gift cards. Well, the attack comes in and it's iTunes gift cards. And they go, oh, well, the email said Amazon gift cards. So, you know what I mean? But if you say, hey, there are scammers out there trying to get people to buy gift cards and send them the numbers, it doesn't matter whether it's Home Depot gift cards or Dunkin' Donuts gift cards. It doesn't matter at that point. They recognize the overall scam, and that makes it more effective to be able to spot that. I hope that makes sense to everybody. So what we're going to do right now, I'm going to step through a couple of quick examples here. This is a wire transfer fraud example here. And you see reading from the bottom to the top because it's an email. It starts out, it's supposed to be the CEO to the COO. And it basically says, are you in the office? Very simple introduction. And the COO says yes. And the CEO then says, I need a payment process to a new vendor, blah, 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 blah. Okay. So they're talking about, I needed to hit the account today. I'll attach the invoice when you're ready to process the payment, et cetera, et cetera. So this is something, though, that there's some red flags in here that we need to see. Before I get into that, there's another one of these versions that I've seen that's really cool. And by cool, I mean sneaky. And it starts out basically with a executive to somebody. It could be an executive assistant. It could be somebody in finance. And it basically says, the opening line is generally something along the lines of, did you get my previous message? So that person, they're like, hey, this is a CEO or this is the executive. And they go back through their email and they reply and they say, sir, ma'am, I'm sorry, I don't see your previous message. How can I help you? Well, what happens here is they crank up the pressure very, very quickly. And the reply from the attacker, pretending to be the CEO, is generally something along the lines of, you know what, I sent you an email this morning. We're in the middle of an acquisition, or, we're buying something, or there's something like that behind it usually. But let's say, we're in the middle of an acquisition. I've been in a meeting this morning. I told them that you were going to send them $25,000 as a good faith show. I can't believe you did that. I promised that it would already be done. I'm going to have to go back in and fix your mess up. So I expect that you get this taken care of right away. Let me know when it's done. And so what they've done is they've cranked up the pressure in a huge way. So this person who's the recipient of this is like, oh my gosh, the CEO's mad at me. They think I messed something up. The world's on fire. I probably screwed this up. And now they're going to do it. And they'll break every policy in the book to make sure that the CEO doesn't fire them, right? Because they think they've made him mad. That's how these things move into that system one thinking so fast and drive you into the emotional responses. Now, in almost all of these, like I said, there's red flags. And so one of the red flags on this one, and keep in mind, these are actually real emails. The ones that I'm showing here are actually real emails here. This one here came from the CEO at an earthlink.net email address. Now, a lot of people, if they do push back on this, understand that they will know how to respond. So if somebody says, hey, sir, ma'am, I noticed this isn't coming from your work email, they're going to say something like, oh man, my work email isn't working on my phone right now. I have a ticket into IT, so I have to do it from this email address. They're going to have an answer for that, but this should make the person really cautious with this. These things should be the trigger that pull us into the system two thinking where we're looking closely. The next trigger on this is I needed to hit the account today. This is a rush sort of thing. This is a sense of urgency that they use to make sure that you don't say, oh, you know what, I'll ask you about it in the morning or something like that. This is a sense of urgency that it needs to be taken care of right now. So these are just a couple of the little red flags that you would see on here. Here's another one that I thought was interesting, also a new one here. Document and intended for XYZ. You've received a secure document, court order, and it says it's coming from the IRS, right? So let's say, you've had some contested things with your taxes or something along those lines. This is one of those things that could really, really really throw people into a tizzy. So this is using the fear and the authority of the IRS to get people to respond. This is a tell right here. It's a court order. It's a link. If you click on that or you highlight that link, it's not going to go to somewhere that's IRS. I guarantee it. But it's going to go to either a document that's infected, and they'll use the same template for a couple of different things. It may go to a document that's infected. In these, it may take you to a website where you need to confirm your identity by giving your name and address and phone number and social security number, so on and so forth, in order to confirm that you're the right person. So you give them all of this sensitive information. There's lots of different ways this will work. But this is one of the key things to look for here. Also, we'll notice that it's from the attorney's office. Okay, this is done for pressure, to put pressure on people. You also notice on the email address up there on the top, it says IRS blah, 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 .com. IRS is a .gov email address, and that should be another red flag that makes you go, hey, wait a minute. The IRS is not a .com, and I guarantee that what's in that block is a lot larger than the 3 letters IRS. But they're gonna do something, try to be convincing there. But .com should be another red flag on this one. Gift card scams, like I mentioned, this is one of the ones that we see all the time. I need you to make a purchase. iTunes gift cards this morning. Gift for a vendor. Are you available to make a purchase now? I've seen similar ones. They come in and they say something along the lines of, it's an executive doing an executive assistant or something. Hey, I need you to run down to the store. I need you to pick up, $500 iTunes gift cards, or let's say $10, $20 iTunes gift cards. These are for the top 10 people in the company. Just want to say thanks. By the way, you're one of those, so keep one of the gift cards yourself. And then they'll say, let me know when you're done. When they get the gift cards, they'll say, okay, I need you to send me a picture of the back with everything scratched off so I have the numbers, because I'm going to send them the gift card via email. So what they've done here is they've used their authority to get somebody to go do something. And by saying, hey, you're one of the top employees, they've now used a little ego stroking there to make them feel good about themselves. And that's going to make them less inclined to push back on the executive and say, sir, ma'am, I think you're full of it, So there's some interesting psychology that goes behind that too. But some of the key things to notice here is it's going to be executive@whatever.com. Look at the email address. Make sure that it actually matches what's going on. There's a key thing that you're going to want to look at. The next thing is it's a gift for a vendor, right? This is kind of the why. This is going to try to answer your questions before you have them. So you're not going back going, this doesn't make sense, and you're not being suspicious. It already sets that at ease right here. Need you to do that this morning. Oh, it's a gift for a vendor. Okay, all right. So now I'm not going to ask that question. I'm not going to be suspicious. It's already answered. And of course, the urgency now. So this drives us into how do we defend ourselves against this kind of fun stuff? You see how they play this in there. And these are just a couple of examples of how they play with the emotional side of things to get us to do things. Hopefully it makes sense to you a little bit here. Again, don't forget, we're going to be doing some questions here in a little bit at the end. So one of the key things we have to understand when we're doing this kind of stuff and defending ourselves is with respect to training people, which is the most effective way to deal with this on that side of things. Awareness and behavior are not the same things. And I love this. Just because I'm aware doesn't mean I care. And I use this example, it's kind of corny, but if I tell you there's a blue Hyundai out front, in the parking lot, you're like, whatever. If I tell you there's a blue Hyundai out front and your name is spray painted across the side of it, you've now moved from being aware to caring why that blue Hyundai is outside with your name spray painted on it. It's that mentality. It's that difference. We have to make it relevant to people so they understand. Now, traditional awareness efforts based on the belief or hope that information leads to action. Just telling people something doesn't mean they're going to change what they do things. We need to focus on a little bit more than just telling them stuff. Again, it's got to be relevant. They've got to understand why it matters. We've got to make it personal to them. So when we teach them certain things like avoiding scams at work, these skills are directly movable over to stuff that happens in our personal lives. The emails that we get on our personal accounts, the scams that our grandparents see and they tell us about. When we recognize these at work and we're taught to do that, that's a service for us also in our personal lives. The other thing we have to understand is doing it once a year isn't going to work. We got to get reflexive behaviors going. And I love this quote from the great orator, Mike Tyson. Everyone has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. So we need to teach people to have reflexive behaviors. When I was in the military, they teach you certain things over and over again. For Army folks, they've taught you how to break down your firearm and put it back together 1,000 times. You're so sick of doing it, you can't believe it. But the reason they do that is when the pressure is on, when you're in system one thinking, it is now also muscle memory to be able to do that. And that's effective in that system one thinking. So when stuff is going on all around you and your rifle doesn't work, you can disassemble it and reassemble it real quick without having to stop and think about things. It becomes reaction. That's where we have to do this repetitive thing, which includes training people. The once a year doesn't fly. So, putting people in a room, throwing it up, they're not going to learn anything. If they do, it's going to not be very long. It's not going to last very long. So what we want to do is we want to break it up into shorter instances. So what I like to see is, quarterly, maybe we do a 20-minute quarterly instead of 160-minute a year. If you can get it down to it, maybe a 10-minute fun little something or something that's real relevant to that time. Like in the holidays, we know that scams are going to be going on around holidays. Why not teach them about those kinds of scams as the holidays are coming in? Do it monthly. Do a 10-minute one monthly that's relevant, that teaches them. Now, they're going to continue to remember things from the last one when you do it this close together, and it's going to build on each other as opposed to once a year. You also want to do the simulated phishing or Vishing or Smishing attacks. And the idea behind that is not to trick them, not to catch them, not to make them feel bad, but to reinforce what they learned in training. It's kind of like doing a classroom learning and then doing a lab afterwards or an exercise. You learn from the exercises, right? That's where you retain more of your information for most people. So that's why you do this. It's not to trick people. And we need to be very clear about that. It's not to trick people. It's to reinforce the training in a fail-safe environment. If they mess it up, okay, fine. What do they get? They get a remedial training class. You're not spending the weekend, recovering your network from being burned down. The other thing that happens is while looking for these, they're also spotting the real ones that come in. What a shocker, right? And so you teach them to spot and report those. Now, we have to understand when it comes to doing this kind of thing, we have to be honest with what our organizational culture will tolerate. For organizational cultures that are not very mature, they're not going to tolerate big jumps into the security side of things. Unfortunately, we have to kind of take baby steps, and we have to understand that we're asking people to do more work to accomplish the same thing. So if I tell somebody, you've been getting into your email with a username and password for years, now I'm going to have to do a username and password, and you're going to have to wait for a text message to come in and add another PIN. We're expecting them to do more work for the same thing. They have to understand why that matters. And part of that is easing it into it. Now, if an organization's recently been breached, it's fairly easy to come in, kick down the doors and go, we're going to do this, this, and this, and this, so it never happens again. But if it hasn't been, people are going to go, well, is this something we really need to do? It's never been a problem before. Got to be cautious with that. So think about that when designing a program. When we're training people, teach them these sorts of things. Look for these red flags. These are like the strings that they use: greed, curiosity, self-interest, urgency, fear, and helpfulness. These are all the key things that they're going to be having in those emails. That if you can spot that part of it, where you go, oh, there's the urgency part. Oh, this is the greed. It says, the Nigerian prince is going to send me a bunch of money. That kind of stuff makes a big difference in being able to spot it. So we want to teach them these lures, just like the card trick, not the specifics, but the overall lures used. Now, the thing I always get is, can you really train people? A lot of us hardcore IT folks don't always believe that. Yes, you can. This is 6.6 million users. Initial click rates on phishing emails, 31% when we do a baseline test. 3 months later, 16.5%. 12 months later, down to 4.8. Is it zero? No, it'll never be zero, but there is no no network control or security control that I've ever been aware of that is 100% effective and doesn't make things not work at all. Okay, there's always going to be some of that. It's part of a larger layer. And I can tell you from experience, the difference in trouble tickets that I had to deal with from a high click rate to a low click rate like that was huge in my past endeavors. Okay, so 84% improvement at the end of a year. That's pretty good. So if you train them once, it's certainly not going to be that way. It has to be kind of ongoing. So some things to think about there. Now, this is the end of my slides right now. I want to go to some Q&A. This is my contact information. Feel free to reach out to me at any time with this contact information. And I'm happy to chat about this kind of stuff. It is fascinating to me. And I'm always trying to help people understand more and more about what it is we're facing here. So having said that, that's all I have for slides. Do we have any questions?
Eric, we do. So thank you so much for going through the presentation. I think you hit on a really important subject in culture. Culture within organizations, can be that leading edge that helps them identify when threats are coming in, temper their employees to take the time to actually respond appropriately, and then more importantly, report some of this information. And one of the questions that we got was, why is it important to actually report these malicious emails and these spoofed emails?
Yeah, I mentioned that a couple of times. I didn't get really into it, but here's the thing. So when you report emails, and there's a lot of free tools out there that allow you to do this, or you can have an email address that you send it to. We have one called the Phish Alert button that's free. You don't have to be a customer or anything. It makes it helpful. But what's important about this is you may have an organization that's being targeted as part of a campaign. So let's say you have 20 employees or 30 employees, and two of them report these emails that say, hey, this is an email saying this, and they're the same email. You can either turn around and warn the other people in the organization, hey, by the way, it appears that we're seeing this. If you see this email, delete it. It's a lie or whatever. Be on the lookout for it. Or what we can do sometimes as security professionals is we can actually go into the email server and remove those from other people before they're ever exposed to it. So, the term threat intelligence is very important here in information security. And this is actually a form of threat intelligence that a lot of folks miss out on because they don't have people actually report that. So it's important. And I'll say this, when people report emails, a lot of times, especially in the beginning, when you get people doing this, they're going to mix up spam versus phishing. And so you're going to want to go back to them and say, hey, you know what, this was, thanks for reporting this. This is actually a spam one, not necessarily phishing. This is how you tell. And you can even do a template to pop that in there for people. Well, eventually they're going to understand this. They're going to learn from that as well. And so it's a learning and a teaching moment, and your reports are going to become much more and more targeted, and you're going to get a lot more false negatives or, true positives through that approach.
Culture, really the way that organizations respond to this, Eric, drives how their employees ultimately respond and continue to drive that message. I had read a statistic that on average, for every infected computer, it typically spreads to about 20. So, it's arguable to say that if an employee reports one of those malicious emails, they could potentially prevent, upwards of 20 other, systems within their system, computers within their organization from being affected.
Absolutely. And it could end up hitting someone with better or higher credential levels than them, right? So they may just be a receptionist that doesn't really have access to things, but the same targeted email could be going to a developer, someone that has access to production with their login credentials, and they may end up falling for it too. And that's a really bad thing. So there's so many positives to having them report these. It just doesn't make sense not to, honestly.
Eric, another question that we get is, we'll be discussing with a client and they'll say, we just went through a massive IT infrastructure upgrade. We've handled, it's our, threat detection, and we have intrusion detection controls, and we have this sitting on our firewall, and our servers protected with this, and, quarterly, vulnerability assessments. But it seems like even with all that high tech equipment, it really just still takes one employee that's whether unmotivated, unaware, or, just misinformed to completely crumble that system down. Is that true?
Yes. I mean, we have to understand when we're architecting a system, we have to think about that from the angle of what if the people do this? And that's a key differentiator too, right? Like we can put all this technology in and great firewalls to keep attackers from coming in from the outside. And we can, do app scans and make sure that our web server and all that stuff is good. But if we're not actually hardening from an inside out attack, then we're missing the point. So the idea of putting technology in all these places, it's fantastic. And we do need to do it, but we have to understand what our real threats are. And my colleague, I'm going to plug his book right now. It's an older book, but it's still awesome. My colleague, Roger Grimes, wrote a book called A Data-Driven Computer Defense. And I love his approach to that. And that is figure out where your attacks come from. Figure out what your vulnerabilities are. If it's your people, that doesn't mean you put up more firewall stuff over here, right? That means you focus on the people side. If you're getting Java exploited all the time, if that's your major way that folks are getting stuff in there, you're not going to focus on PowerShell hardening, right? You're going to work on Java. But every organization is a little bit different, and you need to figure out what it is that's your biggest threat. Most of the time, though, you're going to want to have something in place to deal with that human factor.
Eric, how often are the same organizations affected by, ransomware or malware or, business email compromise? They've had it happen once, and here we are, 2-3 months later, and, same old story. Is that a common theme?
Unfortunately, yeah. And there's a couple of things that happen here. There was one just recently, I think it was Guess, the clothing company. They got hit several months ago with Qbot, which was a botnet. Okay, and so somewhere along the line, someone got in there with this botnet. They found it. They thought they had removed it. But what's happened is, interestingly enough, Qbot and Revel, depending on how you want to say it, but that ransomware group have actually been working together. And lo and behold, a couple months later, they get hit with the Revel ransomware. And basically, what we think happened is they had opened up a hole. They still had some persistence in there, and then they sold that access or partnered with the Revel group to do that. And I think Qbot was working with DarkSide for a while. I mean, they're pairing up out there. It is not the kids in your basement drinking Mountain Dew, eating pizza that we're dealing with here. So they're working together like that. And in this case, like I said, they just did that. I've also seen it where an organization got hit. I think it was in Great Britain. And I believe they paid a 2.4 million pound ransom. They got their stuff back. They restored everything, but they never figured out necessarily how the attackers got in. And they didn't clean up well. Now, when I talk about recovering from ransomware, the thing I always say is nuke the machines from orbit. It's the only way to be sure, right? You start with a brand new install. You restore just the data. You don't restore a bare metal of the machines. And the reason for that is these folks will get in there and they will build back doors in, and they'll sit there for a couple of months without doing anything. The average dwell time these days is like 200 days. They don't wait that long in ransomware all the time, but they'll sit there for a couple of months till they've infiltrated your backups. Now you restore that machine and you just open the doors again to them again. So they paid 2.4 million pounds, restored everything, and a couple months later had to pay 2.4 million pounds again to this same company.
Wow. Some of the other information we hear too, Eric, is that I'm not a target industry. I'm not in healthcare. I'm not in financial services. I don't have payment card processing. Is that a false sense of security to think that just because you don't fall into, say, one of those top three, classes of business that are high level targets, that there's any sense of security?
Yeah, I alluded to that early on. And the thing is, again, what makes ransomware so powerful is you need access to your data. I don't care what industry you're in. If you don't have access to your invoices, you don't have access to your customer list, you don't have access to the intellectual property to make that widget, there's a significant amount of value right then and there for you. The average, I believe the latest numbers I saw from Sophos, the average downtime for a ransomware attack is like a week. They're at least a week down with that. Now, I don't care what you're doing. If you can't bill the people that owe you money, you can't pay the bills that you owe, and you can't make things that you need to sell, whether it's artwork for making t-shirts or whatever, it doesn't matter. That's going to impact you. And So it doesn't matter what industry you are. It doesn't even matter what size your organization is, because a lot of this stuff is just going out there. And it's just getting flooded out there. If they can only get 10 grand from you, fine. They're 10 grand greater than they were before. It doesn't matter to them. So yeah, that's a false sense of security in a big way.
So really, it's just about an easy cash grab and the easiest way to cause disruption to the organization.
Yeah. And with ransomware, we see the big stuff in the news all the time. Okay. So for every like big one that we see that makes the news, there's probably 50 to 100 little organizations that are fighting the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
Um, we just don't see that. It's not newsworthy anymore every time somebody happens. Now, I used to spend a lot of time on the dark web, and I still go out there occasionally and look at the ransom sites. So what'll happen is these ransomware operators, they'll dump data up there and say, here's an example of the data we stole from you, to prove that they have the data, so that people will pay. Because that's the other part of ransomware, is it's not just about getting your data back anymore. It's about them taking that and publishing it publicly, which can be catastrophic for some organizations. But I was seeing 5, 6, 7 different companies a day from each of the different groups that are publishing that stuff up there. And I wasn't looking at all of them by any means. I mean, it's mind blowing how often this is happening.
Wow. So that's bringing us to our conclusion, Eric. And the last question I have is, with so much focus on cybersecurity and awareness, and these businesses, being crippled by this wave of threats, why can't they catch these bad actors? And more importantly, are we on the cusp of this getting better, or is it going to get worse?
So a lot of the problems that we have here is a lot of this stuff is done from countries where we can't extradite. We don't have legal authority to do anything. In a lot of cases, we know who the players are that are dealing with this, but there's not much we can do about it. Now, recently, law enforcement pressure has been coming on a lot stronger, especially on the ransomware side, especially since the attacks on the pipeline. So the dark side group after the pipeline, they got shut down. Now, it's important to understand, first of all, that a lot of these groups, they use what's called a ransomware as a service approach. So the people behind it, the developers, aren't actually doing the attacks. They're hiring out people called affiliates, and they'll do a profit sharing on that. 70% of the revenue goes to the affiliates that do the attack, 30% to the developers, the dark side group, for example. So they don't always know who's being attacked, which is what happened in the pipeline one. So they got hit. The pipeline went down, law enforcement got all over them, and then shut down all of their infrastructure. Okay. So that was kind of a wake up call. A lot of the dark web sites that dealt in ransomware gangs started putting out stuff saying, we're not talking about that here anymore. We're not. And they started shutting that down, which was interesting. We saw Ziggy ransomware group give up all the decryption keys for everybody because the law enforcement was on top of them. Revil just happened after, this last round of stuff with Kaseya. They went silent for a while. And now all of a sudden, Kaseya has the universal decryptor key, but they went silent. They stopped. And where that was actually dangerous is a lot of the people hit by them no longer had the tech support that they offer. So they paid for the decryptors. They got them. Some didn't get them because they shut down right away. But then they weren't able to recover their data because the place went away. So we're seeing law enforcement pressure on this having some impact. But honestly, look at how many arrests don't happen as a part of this, right? They may shut down, but like Revil will come back. Even if they don't come back as Revil, they'll come back as a different name. And they'll continue doing what they're doing, and they will have learned from what they did. So it's going to be even more dangerous.
Wow. So, organizations by large have to be prepared for that threat that they're facing today, that next wave of threats. And, the initial response for our industry was to buy a cyber liability insurance policy. And unfortunately, while that's an important part of your restoration and recovery plan, it's going to do little to actually prevent that next wave of threats. So, for our Seubert Associates customers, we have partnered with KnowBe4. We have some preferred pricing as well as some long-term pricing structures in place to help you, bring this to your organization and focus on developing that offensive strategy to couple with that defensive strategy to keep, the bad actors at bay. For our customers, please reach out. We can provide additional details on how to get set up with KnowBe4. And for anyone joining us as a guest, by all means, same rules apply. Please reach out and we'd be happy to discuss our plan, our approach, our solution towards staving off these cyber threats. and bringing great resources like no before to our customers. With that, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Eric, thank you so much for the time and the very informative discussion on the best ways that employers can help prevent their employees from clicking those links that can destroy their organization.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you, everyone.